Hello and welcome to the Audit and Risk Committee. You have the agenda papers in front of us. I'll move to the first item. This is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies for absence, please?
No apologies for absence, Councillor. Would you like to do a brief introduction?
Yeah. Thank you for that reminder. Okay. Introductory remarks for this remote meeting. This is a meeting of the Council which will be held remotely. The Council is being recorded and streamed via YouTube where members of the public are able to watch the meeting. The Council does not monitor and is not responsible for any remarks made on YouTube. The recording will be available on the Council's website following the meeting. All members have been provided with a remote committee guidance note prior to the meeting. Please can these be adhered to during this remote meeting. All mobile devices should be switched off or set to silent so that the meeting is not interrupted by ringtones. Please switch your profile to mute unless you are speaking. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand in order that I am aware that you wish to speak. For each item, officers will present the report and the committee will discuss it. Okay. So there are no apologies for absence. Move to item number 2, which is declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest at all? None. Okay, that is noted. Move to item 3, which is the minutes, confirmation of the meeting minutes from the Audit and Risk Committee held on the 27th of May 2020. Could I have a vote on the accuracy of those minutes? So I start with myself, Councillor Davis. I vote in favour. Councillor MacDonald.
In favour.
Councillor Kettle.
In favour.
Councillor Mackenzie.
In favour.
Councillor Jeffrey.
In favour.
Thank you very much. This passed unanimously. I move on to item 4, which is the Treasury Management Annual Report and Performance Indicators 2019-20, which starts on page 9. I'll hand over now to the officer to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, this is the Capital and Investment Strategy Outturn Report for 2019-20. This report is required under the Treasury Management Code of Practice, so it's one of the required reports that I bring to the committee every year. It reflects on the strategy that's set before each financial year. So this relates to the strategy that was set for 2019-20. Members will hopefully be aware that the strategy is designed to set up a scheme of delegation under which officers deal with the day-to-day activities of Treasury management within the authority and for the authority. I suppose the first thing I need to say is that everything that we did during the course of the year complied fully with the strategy and that scheme of delegation, so we're not seeking any amendments to that this evening. The report is asking the committee to note the report in full. However, if there are any observations or comments that members would like us to take back when this report's presented to Policy and Resources and ultimately to full council, we're more than happy to do that if that's made clear during the discussion on the report. There's quite a lot of content in here, but I'm going to focus on the enclosures and the information that I think members need to be aware of in order to get a full understanding of all of these activities as they took place during the last financial year. So I'm going to start with Enclosure 2, which begins on page 19 of your packs. I've added a couple of additional sections to this report. The first one is on COVID-19. I think it's probably fair to say that really the full impact of COVID-19 was only really seen at the end of March. We did know that it was coming by then, but the full impact was only really made aware at the end of March. And so the impact on the strategy that we're covering and the activities that we're covering in this report is quite minimal. It will be sort of more fully covered when I do the mid-year and outturn reports for 2020-21, where inevitably there'll be a bit more of an impact and we'll be able to go into a bit more detail. But I thought nonetheless it's worth making the committee aware of some of the things that even for that short period had already started to happen and started to have an effect on some of these areas. And in terms of capital expenditure and to some extent Sempre Homes as well, one of the things was that during lockdown, a lot of construction completely ground to a halt, which affected a number of our capital projects that were underway at that period of time. And for Sempre Homes, that affected some of the construction that they were doing on new homes as well. The other bit that affected Sempre Homes was the restriction that was placed on the buying and selling of properties for a short period during that time as well. Sempre was selling for, well, it had two types of properties that it was trying to sell. First was there were a number of properties that were built with the purpose of being disposed of in full to the market. And the second one is with shared ownership properties. There would be a sale of a portion of the property, an equity share in the property. And those sort of were also restricted under those guidance at the time. A lot of that has started to be lifted. So we've seen activities begin to take place again where they comply with government guidance as they go along. So where restrictions have been lifted and these activities can take place within the guidance that the government has set out, these have started happening again now. So it was a short-term delay, but probably not much more than that. There were some minimal costs incurred during those periods as well. But again, we're starting to see those get underway again now, so that's minimised. In terms of the council's investment assets, I can't go into a great deal of detail because of the fact that this is a public meeting, so I can't talk about individual arrangements that the council's come to with any individual tenants that it has in its investment portfolio. That was reported, I've made reference in the report to the fact that it was reported to the Commercialisation and Future Finance Committee in more detail in a restricted meeting. But I think it's probably fair to say that what we've experienced is more a delay in some of those payments coming through rather than payments not being made at all. So we're expecting that to get back on track in the very near future. I thought, given that as well, it's worth bringing out a bit more about the risk management and how we deal with that. So what I've done is under the headings that start on page 19 and go over to page 20, these are really the mechanisms that we highlighted in the strategy that we would be using to manage risks. And what I've done is just gone into a bit more detail about how we use those during the course of the year. So in terms of the cost modelling, the only one we really had to do in any detail was the purchase of market pavement, which is a new strategic asset, which I'll talk about in a minute. The use of specialist advisors continued during the course of the year. The council used DTZ as property advisors and Link Asset Services as treasury advisors, and they advised the council fully during the course of the year on various activities that take place under the range of activities that this report covers. In terms of the strategic frameworks, members again will be aware that those frameworks sort of drive how we the timing of activities and how we budget for them and how we assume income is then dripped into the council's finances during the course of the financial years. The strategic frameworks that cover investment assets and strategic assets didn't change during the course of the year. The one that did was there was a new Sempre Homes business plan that went to the Housing Development Subcommittee in November last year. And so that's had an impact on some of those returns for Sempre, and those have been incorporated in the budgets for 2021 and going forward. We didn't have to use earmarked reserves at all, so all of the income that we expected to get from all of these activities did materialise. And as I go through them, I'll elaborate on that a tiny bit more. And the last one is proportionality, where we talked about that we shouldn't be over reliant on these commercial activities for the council's finances in the future. And at the strategy stage, we set that the income from commercial activity shouldn't be any more than 10% of the council's budget requirement. And in actual fact, it was 5.53% of the cost of services for the year, which is the nearest equivalent when you're looking at the outturn position as opposed to the budget position. And in terms of the total income of the council, we said it should never exceed more than 5% of budgeted income. And in fact, it was 1.21% of actual income. So we're well below those proportionality ratios, which means that we're not at the moment overly reliant on commercial income, which is probably a safe place to be at the moment. Section 3 that starts on page 21 just outlines really what was the outcome for the capital programme during the course of the year. So the two tables at the top of that page show what was spent, what was proposed to be carried forward, and the outcome positions. The table at the bottom, which is one of the reasons why capital has been added to the what used to be just a treasury strategy, is to capture all of these activities that the council's required under the accounting regulations to account for as capital spend, but doesn't necessarily form part of the capital programme as such. And what I've done is I've outlined all of those at the bottom of page 21, and they will include things like where we provide investment for Sempre Homes. Those loans and the purchase of equity in that company have to be accounted for as assets in the council's accounts at the end of the year. So that's all outlined on the bottom of page 21. Section 4 deals with our asset investments, our investment asset activities during the course of the year. We didn't add to the 4 properties that we have. Members will be aware they're all outside the borough. Combined value, or the combined purchase price, of about 41.5 million. We do set a 2% return target for those properties, and at the end of the year they provided a 2.39% return, so it was slightly above what we budgeted for, and that gave the council in the region of about £190,000 worth of additional income over that we expected to get from those properties. In terms of Sempre Homes, that continues to grow as a company. The council invested additionally in that at the end during 2020-21, and at the end of the year, the total investment in Sempre was 11.5 million in long-term loans, and we had 7.7 million in shares as equity in the company as well. Just a quick verbal update on the second paragraph down on page 23, where I say that the company's made a net loss of 0.5 million. This report was prepared before the audit of Sempre had actually begun, and we'd completed our management review of the accounts. The audit is still ongoing, but our management review of the accounts is now completed. And we are expecting that position to change during the course of that period, and we're expecting Sempre to make a very marginal profit during the course of last year. The main reason for that change has been we spotted some anomalies in the way that the assets have been valued, that we went back and checked with the valuer, and they come back with some revised figures, and that swung that loss that we had in the draft accounts round to a small profit. Still got to be finalised, so it's not a final position at the moment, but we are expecting that loss that we've reported in here to turn into a very small profit. In terms of section 6, members will be aware, hopefully, that during the course of the year, the council acquired its second subsidiary company in the form of Acorn House Developments Basildon Limited. That's a catchy title. That's a property in Great Oaks in Basildon that's being used to convert old office accommodation into new one-bedroom and studio flats. At the end of the year, that work is still ongoing, but at the end of the year, again, the investment in that company stood at 7.6 million in terms of the purchase of equity and contributions for the purchase of the company, and 1.2 million in loans, and that will continue to support that company to continue converting that property into the flats. Section 7 deals with strategic asset acquisitions. There is a £100 million programme for this activity. At the end of the year, the only one that we actually had bought by the end of 31st of March was Market Pavement, which is a strategic site in the town centre that was purchased towards the end of the financial year. Since the end of the financial year, we've also bought a second asset, which is the former Robbins Cinema and Robbins House site in the town centre as well. So we've now got a second one, but for the purposes of this report, I'm only reporting that one. That was the only one that happened before the end of the financial year. So that in essence sort of summarises all of the commercial activity that happened during the course of the year and what we dealt with during the year. In terms of Treasury, that's section 8 that starts on page 24. During this section, the bold print are all of the strategy statements that we made when we were setting the strategy at the beginning of the year, and the text below each of those bullet points is a little bit of narrative about how they've been met. I will go through a few of the numbers just to make members aware of where things have changed. So in terms of the external debt position, or the net debt position, that actually increased by 43.1 million during the course of the year, and that now stands at 218.2 million. The main reason for that increase was not because we took on any additional debt. It was the availability of resources to invest was the difference. All of those activities that I talked about under the commercial heading have all at this stage been financed by the council's cash balances. We've not done any new borrowing during the course of 2019-20. So all of that investment and all of that activity has been funded from cash balances, which has meant that those balances are therefore not available for investment. We've taken that approach because return on investment at the moment is very poor. Borrowing costs are much higher, so it makes more sense to utilise that cash rather than invest it to put off the borrowing for a short period of time until it's actually needed from a cash flow perspective. The table in the middle of page 25 just basically outlines the change in the external debt. So we basically paid back £3 million worth of debt during the course of the year, and we didn't take on any new debt. So we started at 239.1 million and we ended the year on 236.1. The graph just below that is quite a good indication of that internal use of cash. It shows the bars on that graph show the actual borrowing position at the end of the year and during the course of the year. And the capital financing requirement is all of our unfinanced capital spend. So essentially that's where our borrowing, if we weren't using any cash resources, that's where our borrowing would be, that orange line slightly above. The two indicator lines above that, the operational boundary, which is the green one, and the blue one, which is the authorised limit, they're the indicators that are set so that if we undertake all of the activities that are approved, so all of our commercial investment that's approved, all of our strategic assets that are approved already, and fully fund all of our capital programme, that's the sort of level that the borrowing would be at during that period. And what will happen is, as those activities are actually undertaken, the capital financing requirements, so that orange line will move up the graph, and that will give us the space to borrow up to those areas as and when we need to. So the use of that cash at the moment is just a short-term measure. So it's just us taking advantage of those cash balances in the short term. At some point in the future, we will need to turn that into actual borrowing. On page 26, there's a small table just showing the investment return position. We very, very heavily exceeded what was budgeted for during the course of the year. We budget this a bit quite far in advance to the beginning of the financial year, so it's quite difficult sometimes to predict exactly what cash resources are going to be available. In the end, we clearly had a lot more cash available than we expected to have, and that generated quite a considerable return. So we budgeted for 10,000 and our actual outcome was 467,000. But members will also note there that the interest rate was budgeted at 1.05%. The actual rate of return that we managed to get during the course of the year was 0.7. So those rates didn't go up the way that we expected them to either. And just as a point of interest, since the Bank of England reduced its rate to 0.1% earlier this year, we've seen the investment rates drop off even further. And it's getting to the point where it's very, very difficult now to get anything like a decent return. So we'll continue to use cash balances and maximising that position as much as possible. The maturity profile chart on page 27 hasn't changed at all from last year. So that basically just shows the level of debt that needs to be repaid each year. Again, members will hopefully be aware from previous meetings that all of our debts are what we call maturity debts. So we deal with the interest as we go along, but we have to do a cash payment of the principal sum at the end. And this chart actually just indicates the level of those principal payments we'd need to make at the end of each of those financial years. So it'd be the equivalent of the 3 million that we paid back last year. Enclosure 3 is just really all of that information in a more graphical form that perhaps is a little bit easier to look at rather than lots of numbers and tables. The only thing to draw members' attention to, just because it's a bit more interesting than it usually is the graph that's on page 32, which is nothing more exciting than just us tracking the PWB interest rates during the course of the year. But you'll see there's a big jump in the middle of the year, about October time. That's when the Treasury put up PWB rates by 1% overnight. So that reflects that jump in rate. And also the volatility that you see at the end of March, so the last few weeks in March, again, is a reflection of when COVID started to hit and the impact that that had on the economy at that time. Enclosure 4 are the prudential indicators that we're required to report at the end of the year. Again, I don't think there's anything particularly significant in there that I need to bring to the committee's attention. So I think that's probably about as far as I want to go with the introduction, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Mute. Councillor Mackenzie.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned property valuations, and it actually helped with the budget from last year's account. Are you looking at to revalue the properties post COVID-19 to see what impact the assets, what prices have gone on the assets we own?
Yeah, we did actually see a small drop in valuations at the end of March last year. So we've seen that this already had an impact. The bit that's quite difficult is what we're expecting, or what all of the market commentators are expecting is a drop and then a recovery. The bit that's a bit uncertain at the moment is how deep that drop will be and then how quick the recovery will be afterwards. So there may be some short-term pain in respect of property valuations, but we are expecting them to recover over the longer term. So in terms of the investment assets, we've seen a small drop in valuation at the end of 2019-20. We're hoping they'll recover again for 2020-21.
Another question. You mentioned the Robin Cinema site. Does that include did that include the Great Oaks car park? Because I see the council's putting a bid of £5.2 million to expand the car park.
No, it didn't. This was just it's essentially the, again, hopefully members will be aware that the council's purchased the former post office site that sits right next to the Robin Cinema site. And then the HIF bid that the councillor has mentioned covers that whole area, including the Great Oaks car park, the Robin Cinema site, the post office site, and also, and I can't remember which number the car park is. I think it's car park 2, which is the one that sits behind behind the work that's being done at Freedom House for the cinema. So, but that basically covers that whole area. If I'm honest, I don't know what the plans are in terms of the car park offhand, but it doesn't include that at this stage. But it was strategically. Sorry?
We don't own the car park.
Not at the moment. That's owned by Basildon Town Centre Management.
I just wondering how come we've putting a bid to for money to help for property we don't own then.
Again, I haven't got the detail of the HIF bid and the extent to what that actually covers. Perhaps I can gather some information and bring it to members outside of the meeting. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of these, and again, I'm just talking generally here, you know, a lot of this, these type of activities involve partnership working. So it's not to suggest that we won't be purchasing those particular assets, or won't seek to purchase those assets, but there are opportunities for other partners to work with us in sort of wider developments rather than just isolating it to bits of property that the council might own.
Another question on I think it's the post office site. I think so I had a look at the, you know, the youth zone. Is that where the youth zone is going? And if so, how will that work in terms of investments? Will money be moved from back into the investment portfolio, or will the youth zone be classed as the investment?
Do you have information on that at all? Or is that beyond your remit?
Yeah, well, I haven't got any information about the youth zone and where that's planned to be sited, unfortunately. I don't know if anyone else, any of the other officers here have.
I've got the postcode where the bid was placed, that was all. They sent a bid to government for money, and the postcode is for the...
Maybe we could chase it up and have a look into that, but I don't think officers present have the information on that.
I mean, really, you know, my side of the investment portfolio is really just looking at the return it provides to the council, rather than necessarily the detail behind the decisions around what's purchased and what isn't. You know, my side of it is more the sort of modelling of the financial side. But I'm more than happy to see if there's information that can be shared.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other comments from members at all? Okay. Thank you for that report. Sorry, I'm just finished all one-handed. The recommendation is that the page 9 is that the annual report on capital investment and treasury management activities and the prudential indicators for 2019-20 be noted. Any comments and observations by the committee be taken into account when a report is presented to Policy and Resources Committee. So we note the report. Thank you, Tony. I now move on to item number 5, which begins on page 35, which is the Internal Audit and Counter-Fraud Annual Report 2019-20. I'm going to hand over to the officer to present the report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm tasked tonight with presenting members of my annual report for 2019-20. The report itself serves two main purposes: to communicate an opinion on the Council's control environment. And by control environment, I'm talking about the Council's arrangements for risk management, internal control and governance. The report also summarises the work undertaken in arriving at that opinion. I will also touch briefly on the work of the counter-fraud team. For the most part, we've been able to complete the audit plan for 2019-20. It's fair to say COVID-19 presented the audit team with some difficulties in terms of actually completing the work. So the team essentially weren't in the office any longer and were tasked with getting the evidence remotely. So that's mainly via emails and conducting meetings via Skype or Teams. So it did present some difficulties, but we were able to complete the audit plan for the most part. One review is currently outstanding, and that's sundry debtors, but that's in the stages of being completed over the next couple of weeks. Also, there's a couple of areas that we didn't do any work on in terms of what was planned in the original audit plan. We didn't undertake work in relation to performance management and also in relation to the workforce strategy. I think Sarah will touch on performance management and where we're at with regards to that area later on in the report on the annual governance statement. If I can ask members to turn to page 43, what this does is provide members with a summary of the work undertaken in 2019-20. And as we can see from the table provided, 3 audit reviews received a limited assurance opinion, whilst 13 reviews received either an inadequate or substantial rating. In addition to the mainstream audit reviews, we also complete audit work in other areas, and this mainly is in relation to grant certification work. So we do work on behalf of the external auditor in relation to housing benefit subsidy, and we also do grant certification in relation to the Go Trade claim. In relation to the 3 limited audit reviews, what I can say to members is that service departments are well progressed in addressing the recommendations. And in relation to the private rented accommodation audit review, most of the audit recommendations were actually implemented before we issued the final report. So management have made good progress in relation to those audits. I'd like to, what I'd like to do now in terms of just to sum up. So based on the work we have completed as outlined in the table provided 43, my opinion is that of adequate assurance in that the practices for risk management, internal control and governance are generally sound and fit for purpose, but there are areas for improvement. I would now like to basically just talk about the work of the counter fraud team and what it's achieved. So the counter fraud team now consists of 4 members of staff, and over the period 2019-20, we actually received in excess of 700 fraud referrals. In investigating this work, it resulted in savings of £161,000 cashable savings and an additional 1.3 million in non-cashable savings. In addition to those good results, we also returned 7 council properties to the council as a result of basically identification of tenancy fraud. So these are now 7 council properties that are available to residents to now live in. The only other thing I'd like to talk about is in relation to our work. Our work is basically conducted in compliance with the public sector internal audit standards. This basically sets out best practice in terms of actually how an internal audit function undertakes its work. And what we do annually is complete a self-assessment against the code or the standards. And it basically says to us, is the team fit for purpose? Is it carrying out its work in compliance with the standards? And what we've found from the self-assessment is, yes, we do comply with the standards. So it's all good from that perspective. But I suppose in a way, members shouldn't just take my word for it. What we also do is have an external assessment undertaken every 5 years. So an external provider comes in and does an audit on internal audit, basically confers whether we're fit for purpose, whether the internal audit team is doing what it should be doing. And the last one was undertaken in 2016-17. I think the next one's due in 2022-23, and that will then take a further review of the work of the internal audit team. I suppose the only other thing I'd like to comment on is in relation to service departments and completing audit recommendations. At presently, we have 104 live recommendations on the performance system, of which only 28 are overdue, which relates to 27%. So what that tells me is managers are making good progress in relation to implementing audit recommendations. And at this point in time, I have no concerns in terms of progress made. That about sums up. I'm quite happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that report. Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you. On page 49 and 50, it talks about payroll. It says that the reconciliation between iTrent and Integra has not been reinstated. Do you know when that's going to be reinstated? And it also mentions phantom employees, or ghost employees, sorry. Have any been found, and what's been done to ensure that they don't appear?
Okay, yeah, there's not any phantom employees identified on the system. There's 2 sort of controls in a way in terms of phantom employees. There's budget monitoring undertaken by, I suppose, service departments. So if they see any costs which or employees they don't recognise, and then at that point in time they would highlight that to finance and to HR and saying that there's a cost going through here I can't reconcile to. I don't know who that relates to. And also at the time of taking on new employees, HR perform a number of checks to basically legitimise the individual. Does the contract exist? You know, has the person actually started? So yeah, there's a few controls in relation to that. So we would hope that no ghost employees exist in the system, and there are sufficient internal controls to guard against that. In relation to the reconciliation, I don't actually have that recommendation in front of me, so I don't know what the timetable for that was. So, but I can come back to members on that particular recommendation.
Tony?
So I can probably help with that one, because we, on the finance side, we do actually undertake that reconciliation on a regular basis. So we have got a full reconciliation for the financial year 2019-20 between the payroll system and Integra, which we've made available to the external auditors as part of our working papers on the for the external accounts or the end of year accounts.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for your help.
Is it worth updating the report to reflect that then?
Yeah, that can be done, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 66, bullet point 2, it says there is no formal process / documentation for tracking whether financial charges or restrictions have been discharged. Is that part of the, let me just scroll up a second. Is that part of the action plan that's been put in place? And how do you see that working going forward?
Sorry, what page is that on?
Page 66.
Okay, bear with me.
I can take that one if you want.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Mike.
Great.
Yeah, we've done, as Councillor Jeffrey will know, we've been doing quite a bit of work with land charges around how they actually get registered onto the system and then how they get followed up and chased up. So there, at the time of the audit, there were no formal process of documentation for tracking whether or not a financial charge had been discharged and therefore been removed from the system. What the head of planning is now doing as part of this audit, because they actually requested this audit to take place, is to completely rewrite their processes and procedures. And myself and the Assistant Director for Resources in terms of finance have been working with her to make sure that there is a full audit trail in terms of how charges then get discharged once they have been paid, so that it's very clear that that has been dealt with. That we're still not there yet. We're still in the process of putting those processes in place, and there's still a lot of work still to be done. But that was actually one of the main reasons why the audit was actually asked for. The head of planning wanted the complete review done of the land charge database and how it operated, and particularly how financial charges, etc., were dealt with. I think we've had a follow-up to this at the risk working group, and I believe we're due for another follow-up to come in our next round of meetings. So, okay.
Thank you for that. Any other comments or queries? I just want to pick up one issue on the general item, although you did touch on it regarding your team. There we go. Our mouse behave itself. There we go. So I just want to ask a couple of questions. Working remotely, are your information systems that you use truly accessible? And again, with remote working, do you have access to all the relevant management and senior officers as and when you need them?
It's not really presented many difficulties in getting access to the systems we require access to. I think there's been some delay in terms of getting information from senior management, but that's expected, what with their new priorities in relation to COVID-19. But as I said, we managed to complete the audit plan. So I suppose in a way, we have been supported quite well by senior management. If we hadn't completed the audit plan, then I would be raising some concerns. But the audit plan has been completed, and with the good grace of service management, we've managed to do that. So for the most part, yeah, it's not presented as any problems. We expect certain delays because obviously you've got other priorities, but for the most part, we are getting responses from senior management. And we have indeed started to progress audits from the 2021 audit plan already. So yeah, we are being supported.
That's good to hear. Thank you for that. You're reassured as a committee. Okay, if there are no further questions, I believe this report is for noting, so it has been duly noted. Thank you for the report. Thank you for the hard work that's gone into it. I'll now move on to item number 6, which is the annual governance statement. And it starts on page 75. And I'll hand over to the officer to present the report. Thank you.
Can I just check if everyone can hear me, because I've lost most of you off of my screen?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right, okay, thank you, Chairman.
Yes, Sarah.
Okay, thanks. So if I can ask members to turn to agenda item number 6, which is on pages 75 through to 119. So all local authorities are required to maintain a local code of corporate governance and to produce, in line with proper practice and guidance, an annual governance statement. The purpose of the AGS is to evaluate the council's governance arrangements as set out in our local code. And the AGS must be endorsed by the Audit and Risk Committee prior to its certification by the leader.
Is that just me?
No, I think we've lost Sarah. Do you want me to
I've lost her as well. Yeah.
take over?
Yes, please. If she switches
Okay.
off her video in a moment, that might help. Hello, Sarah?
Sarah, are you back? Or do you want me to take it?
I think she's probably snowed in.
Yeah, we were
Can you
joking
hear
about
me
the
again?
weather, saying it was going to get snowed in. We can hear you, Sarah, yes.
Yeah, you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
I'll
Would,
try again.
Try again. If you drop out, I don't mind picking up for you.
Okay, sorry, I've lost it 3 times, so we'll try again. So, okay, the AGS provides assurance over the council's governance arrangements, together with identifying areas of future focus and improvement. So our local code has been reviewed and to ensure the council's governance arrangements remain fit for purpose. However, there were no significant changes proposed. And the local code for 1920 is attached to enclosure number 2 for your endorsement. The local code is supported by the assurance framework that sets out how and on what we will seek assurance on. We haven't made any changes since last year, and this is enclosure number 3. The AGS incorporates continuous review of the effectiveness of our governance arrangements.
Paula, could you proceed, please? Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So Sarah was just talking about, obviously, our local code of corporate governance, which is in the agenda pack for your endorsement, and also the assurance framework, which is attached to enclosure 3 for your information. Both of those documents I keep being muted.
We can hear you now.
You can hear me now. Okay.
Yeah.
So you said I was being muted by the host. Okay.
I've just unmuted you.
Okay, thank you. Right. So I'll move on in terms of the council has good foundations in place. So we've undertaken a complete review of our governance arrangements in order to produce the AGS, as we do every year. The council has got good foundations in place, and the 1920 governance review has not identified anything of significant concern to raise with you again at the moment. You'll see that there's a number of issues that are carried over from last year, but there's nothing new that is significant. But what we do have to recognise in the annual governance statement is that COVID-19 has had an impact on our governance arrangements. And that was from March and obviously continues into this year. And it's important that our governance, when we do our governance statement, that we actually it's a living document. So it's not just as at the 31st of March, it's a living document to the point in which it gets published. So, so how has COVID-19 impacted our governance arrangements? We've noted in the report and on the governance statement that there have been a number of ways that we have been impacted. Obviously, there has been some severe changes to the way in which our decision making and the conduct of our meetings takes place. There has been an impact on business as usual and service deliveries. We have had to change what we've done. We've had to stop some services and we've had to actually engage in new services in terms of helping the vulnerable. So there are a lot of new activities that we've had to start in order to respond to the national crisis. And obviously there have been some funding and logistic consequences of actually delivering the government's response. Obviously that will have particularly affected our funding in terms of cash flow and also our income generation and collection of council tax and NNDR that's due. So there have been some impacts. We're in the process of still assessing the degree of those impacts. The council has in place a COVID-19 working group for both members, and there is an officer recovery group that are dealing with a number of different themes to ensure that we recover back from the situation to what will become the new norm going forward. So we will be accessing a big exercise is currently underway at looking at our existing projects and our programmes, because some of those obviously were put on hold during the crisis. A lot of those have started to restart. So you'll have seen the regeneration of areas starting to pick up again after work stopped. But there's also some other pressing priorities now that have come to light as a result of COVID-19, which means that we may need to reprioritise some of the council's particular objectives and outcomes it was hoping to achieve this year. Also, the risk environment has changed quite considerably during COVID-19. Obviously, where there is some corporate risks around how we have managed with the situation and how we will come back from recovery in terms of that, and making sure that we do that in a safe and sensible manner. But you'll be pleased to know, and I think Sarah picked this up in her report at the last meeting, that we've actually had a COVID-19 risk register been going, where we've been assessing the risks of COVID-19 to the council and the controls we've put in place to manage those. And I believe we've already agreed that the working group will take a look at those risks and how those have been managed. So the review that we undertook of our governance arrangements recognises that there are governance areas which we want to enhance to continue to do the right things in the right way in line with our values, and also to address the significant challenges that we face as an authority. So as a result of the review, there is a detailed action plan developed to support the areas where further work is being undertaken. And an action plan is in place for all of those areas that are being marked in the AGS as in the amber to red columns. And this committee will be responsible for monitoring the 3 key actions that are in that document. So if I can get members to turn to the AGS, which is on page 101, you'll see here that this is the kind of the review of effectiveness. This is giving you the opinion of where we are in terms of the council. And this states quite clearly that we have adequate arrangements which continue to be regarded as fit for purpose and comply with the council's local code of corporate governance. The report goes on to talk about particular areas of good governance and bits and pieces that we've done. I think as well, it's important to highlight, which we have done in the AGS, is the fact that actually our governance arrangements have got stronger as a result of COVID-19. And there's actually been some really good working practices that have come out of that. And obviously you'll see there some of the highlights of the good work that the council has done during this period. And I think that really reinforces Basildon's strong governance and leadership arrangements. Within the AGS, there is a comment here from the Head of Paid Services, Section 151 officer, and myself as Chief Audit Executive in terms of our opinions around the governance arrangements. And obviously that leads on from the report that Mike has presented to you today. From page 109 onwards, you have, Sarah has taken a slightly different approach to actually be able to demonstrate our governance arrangements to you. She's highlighted each of the individual principles and then has identified for you our strengths, the areas where we want to do some things to improve things, and then some of the couple of areas which are challenges to us. There are three main areas of challenge for us, and that's about continuing to develop our strategic approach to partnership working. As you can imagine, COVID-19 has had quite a significant impact on how we work with our partners. And as a result of that, we want to see what work we can continue to do working with our partners going forward. So there's some lessons to be learned from that. And there is a partnership review underway. The other two key areas are that we have got the building blocks in place now for information governance, but further work is still needed to be done across the organisation to actually embed that. And until that's properly embedded, we're not comfortable to move that into the strengths field. And then the last area is around programme and project management and defining and managing our standards for project management. Again, significant amount of work has been done on this to identify what our process and procedures are being. As a result of COVID-19, we are looking at the corporate programme to make sure that we are focusing on the right priorities now. And as a result of that, project briefs and programme briefs are being prepared and approved by the senior management team to make sure we have clarity about our focus going forwards. Mike mentioned about performance management in his talk that he said that Sarah would be picking up. Obviously, that was one of our key challenges last year. We've moved that into an area that's still for improvement, but it's not so much of a challenge as it was previously. We have done an awful lot of work on what we're calling outcome-based accountability. So each service has been having a review to identify what their key outcomes are, and therefore what the relevant performance measures that need to be in place for each of those services. That work is still continuing. Unfortunately, it's been delayed slightly because of COVID-19. Trying to do those kind of reviews over Skype and Teams has been somewhat difficult. I do feel for the team. But then once that's completed, they'll be looking at how then we'll be engaging with members in terms of reporting going forward, which I know was an issue that was raised by the chairman previously. So I think, Sarah, unless there's anything else that I've missed that you was going to say, because I see you've changed rooms. So unless there's anything else that you wanted me to say, I think if I can just draw members back to the recommendation. So you're asked to note and endorse the AGS. Once you do that, the leader of the council and the chief exec will both sign the document. Both have actually seen and have seen the document and have been through it with us. So they're comfortable with that. They just require your endorsement really for their signatures. So any questions, I'm sure Sarah will be more than happy to pick up.
Thank you, Paula. Are there any comments or questions on the report? Okay, thank you for that. Just wanted to briefly raise It mentions in the report about relevant steering groups, I think. Is there officer representation from audit and risk of all the relevant steering groups on areas relating to good governance, just to ensure that audit and risk are fairly represented?
Can you just point me to whereabouts in the document you're referring to, please? Is that on the strengths?
General question, I'm asking, are officers represented on steering groups that they feel they can contribute to their governance role?
You're talking about officers rather than
Yeah.
me? Yeah, okay. So at the moment, we are doing we're completing a review of the internal officer decision-making arrangements and structures. And obviously we have ET and SLT. So Owen Sparks, who is the Assistant Director for Resources, who is my boss, sits on SLT and represents the governance wider and finance aspects. And then beneath that, there are a number of delivery groups that are being set up now to look at pushing forward on the corporate programme, and in particular looking at particular areas of the council's operation. The intention is that I'll be sitting on those delivery groups with some of the officers from the audit team and the risk team to actually take part in some of the working groups that sit beneath those. We do have a governance and assurance delivery group, which looks at the governance arrangements of the authority, and they receive reports prior to them coming to the audit committee as well, so that they're able to do a robust challenge of our arrangements. And we advise them if we are escalating anything to yourselves at that point. At that meeting, I currently chair that board or that delivery group. And I think, yes, there is fair representation. We are changing our internal decision-making arrangements at the moment, and they've still yet to be bedded in. But that decision was only taken in the last couple of weeks. So it's just, we've got to just watch that going forward. So perhaps that's a question to ask in a couple of months to say, is that now well embedded?
Thank you for that. Are there any other queries or comments from members? Okay, I believe we require a vote on this to endorse it. Could I just clarify that, please?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah. Okay. So bear with me, I'm doing this all left-handed. Okay, so I'll go and ask each member individually to vote for or against or abstain. I'll start with myself. I vote in favour. Councillor MacDonald.
For.
Councillor Kettle.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie.
In favour.
Thank you. And Councillor Jeffrey.
For.
Thank you. That's passed unanimously. And thank you to all officers involved in the report. It is a document that's going out public and displayed on the website once it's been formally ratified for anyone who to view. Okay, so moving on to item number 7, which is the work programme. I'll hand over, that starts on page 121, and I hand over to the officer to present her report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The work programme was presented at the last Audit and Risk Committee, which was agreed and endorsed. There's been no changes at this point, so this is just for you to continue to note the work programme, unless any councillors have any questions.
Any comments or queries on the future work programme? Okay. Is that for noting or voting?
Noting, councillor.
Right, thank you. That's duly noted. Okay, that concludes the meeting. I'd like to say thank you to everyone and have a good evening.
And you. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody. See you soon.
Thanks.
Bye.